Good evening, friends. As you are aware that we have already uploaded so many videos related to New Income Tax Act 2025, Ready with Finance Act 2026, and all of you are enjoying. As I hope in this direction we are uploading and making new video which is related to a new topic, which is interpretation of tax statute, particularly the with reference to the New Income Tax Act 2025. So we are going to discuss all the provisions, how to interpret charging provisions, and details nitty-gritty related thereto, and other important aspects of income tax law. So one of the landmark judgment in CIT versus Shahzada Nand and Sons 1966, 3 SCR 379, para number 10, it was Supreme Court has held that the rule of interpretation of charging provision shall be a strict interpretation, meaning thereby if something is taxable within the charging provision, then only government could levy and collect tax. Otherwise, tax could not be collected. Just so, no one should make a mechanism that to the tax collection could not be maximized by way of making those transactions which are not subject to income tax. For example, if there is agriculture income which is itself is exempt and not taxable at all under the income tax, so AO could not make assessments and charge any tax thereon. Another important judgments recently in the Commission of Customs versus Dilip Kumar and Company 2018 9 SCC 1 para 15, it was again reiterated by Honorable Supreme Court that the taxes should be levied and collected in accordance with provisions of law. Otherwise, it is not a valid collection of tax, and if after appeal, etc., government have to refund those taxes. So, charging provision is very important, and while interpreting charging provisions, the basic rule or the general rule is strict interpretations, and if there is any doubt in the charging provision, the benefit goes to the assessee or taxpayer or to the subject and not to the revenue or the tax department. So, if there is any doubt in charging provision, certainly the benefit goes to the taxpayer and not to the income tax department or the revenue. This point we must keep while interpreting the charging provisions or levy provisions of tax laws, particularly the income tax. So, essential element we must understand what are the essential element of charging or levying provisions. So, there must be a subject matter of tax. For example, household property income or rental income or salary income or capital gain income is subject, or business income or business receipts is subject matter of tax. So, in any tax statute, there must be the subject matter of tax. That is very important. Then, who is the person liable to tax? That also must be clearly mentioned in the tax statute. Then another important point is the amount or value on which the amount is taxable. That is also important, and the rate of tax applicable thereon is also important. Then how to collect the tax, so procedure must be there in the tax statute. So these are the essential elements of charging or levy provisions that must be kept in mind. And while construing Revenue Act is to give fair and reasonable construction to their language without leading to one side or other side. So while interpreting tax laws, we must be fair enough to interpret neither in favor of taxpayer nor in favor of revenue or the government, as it was held in one of the landmark judgment in the Vodafone International Holdings VV versus Union of India 2012 judgment, which is one of the important landmark judgment of recent times of the Apex Court. Further, in another judgment, CIT versus Vatica Township Private Limited, tax law has to be unambiguous and should prescribe the liability to pay tax in the clear terms. If provision of taxation statute is unambiguous, then no benefit to the tax departments or revenue, and benefit goes to the taxpayer. So, while imposing tax or charging provisions or other provisions in the tax statutes, it is important that there are clear-cut provisions that who will pay the tax, then how the amount will be determined, the tax, the rate of tax, the amount on which tax, the assessable value, or we can say the taxable amount, then all the provisions of procedure related to demand, recovery, collection of tax, etc., etc., all these must be there. We must note that. Then if the literal interpretation failed or a strict interpretation failed, then purposive interpretation is the alternate remedy so that the purpose must be achieved. So this point also must be kept in mind. While interpreting exemptions provisions, the exemption provision, if there is any doubt or language is not clear, the benefit will goes to the revenue, to the tax department, to the government, not to the SSA, because if the exemption is provided, then the government has created exceptions where there is no tax. If the government has created exception where there is no tax, then certainly it must be clearly worded by the statute. And if the statute has no clearly worded, the benefit will go to the revenue, not to the tax department, as it was held in various judgments of apex court we have just discussed. Then how to read exemption notification is another important aspect. One of the recent judgment, although the judgment is related to the GST, but how to read exemption notification, Honorable Apex Court in the case of State of Karnataka versus Tagar Vasudeva Ambrish, 2025, 181 taxman.com, 199, Supreme Court has held that while exemption notification reading, we must go and check. Activity specific exemption are there where person is not important. So activity is very important. For example, in this case, residential property for residential accommodation was exempted. So the important point is the activity, not the person who is providing this property for residential accommodation. That is not important. It is the exemption to residential property for residential use that is important. So activity specific exemption is that. Then there is person specific exemption also, which may be conditional or unconditional. For example, in the case of NPO, exemptions is conditional. Agriculture income, it is unconditional exemption. So, and it is exemption in the hands of all. Few exemptions are in the hand of particular taxpayer. So, person specific exemptions also. Then liberal and strict construction of exemption provision are to be invoked at different stages. That was explained by Apex Court in this case only, where there are two stages while interpreting the exemptions. Firstly, the broad parameters where exemptions is mentioned in exemption notifications or in the law itself. Then once the basic conditions are fulfilled, then the exemption should be interpreted purposefully. So purpose must be achieved. For example, if residential accommodation is provided for residential purpose, then the purpose is residential purpose. See, if the building is used for residential purpose, then there is no reason to deny exemption. So that is purposive interpretations. That is very important. Now the primary rule is the strict rule of literal interpretation, and if literal interpretation failed due to any reason or absurdity or absurd result of the literal interpretation, then certainly we must adopt the purposive interpretation. That is also important, as physical statute certainly must be strictly interpreted, particularly for the charging provisions as well as for penal provisions. So for imposition of penalty, there must be clear-cut provision in the tax statute. Otherwise, there is no reason to impose penalty upon anyone. Another important point, which is the mischief rule or hidden rule. In the tax laws, it is the landmark judgment in Bengal Immunity Company versus the state of Bihar, where Apex Court has decided that important point to be kept in mind while how the mischief overruled or removed by the legislature in the statute. So what is important is what was the law before making any act or amendment in any law, what was the mischief or defects in the existing law, and what was the remedy provided for that. Then what was the remedy provided by legislature to resolve the mischief, that is very important. Then the true reason of remedy and how to suppress the mischief and advance the remedy. So if all these are taken into account, certainly we will got a conclusion para where the interpretation should be to remove the mischief or advance the remedy. That is very important. In the another judgment, which is the landmark judgment KB Varghese versus ITO, where the mover of bill taken into account to understand the provisions of tax laws. So this is the external aids of interpretation, where although something not specifically mentioned in the tax statute, but the minister has moved and parliament discussion or debate also take into account, or a report of various committees etc., how the government has taken care of those reports, that also must be taken into account. So we are going to discuss that there are primarily the two aids of interpretation. One is internal aids of interpretation and external aids of interpretation. Internal aids of interpretation are the base of interpretation taken from the statute itself. For example, various statutes has examples, illustrations. So all those example, illustration, punctuations, definitions must be taken into account while interpreting. For example, under income tax law, there is basic definitions. All the basic definition applicable for the entire act is mentioned in section 2 of the Income Tax Act 2025. The interpretations section is also mentioned at the end of every chapter. So that is applicable for a particular chapter. So if we have to understand in term used in the head of taxation of profit or gains from business or profession, then the last section of the chapter has provisions to understand. Suppose we have to understand the taxation of NGO, then the last section 355 is defining all the terms used in this chapter 17b. So we must understand all this. Then the external interpretations are also very important. If the internal interpretation does not provide meaning to or purposeful meaning, then certainly, or there is no definition in the statute itself, so we are bound to go for external aids of interpretation, such as the move in the parliament by the ministers, or explanations of the ministers, or parliamentary debate, or dictionary meaning, or common parlance meaning, or various general clause act, or so many things. So externally we have so many aids. Then circulars are also to be taken into account, because circulars are contemporaneous exposition, means generally after Finance Act, government brought circulars to explain the provisions of finance bill every year. So this year also finance bill certainly will be explained by the circulars, and circulars generally brought just after finance bill on passing of Finance Act. So in such a case we must go through the circulars. That is also very important. And then another important judgment is court to take judicial notice of the proceedings of parliament, which was decided and considered in Lok Shiksha Trust by versus CIT 1976, one of the important landmark judgments for trust. This is also important. Then, while ascertaining whether a particular amendment is substantive or clarificatory in nature, we have to add to the language or in the statutes. So language itself provide that whether the explanation is added in the statute explanatory in nature, or declaratory in nature, or curative in nature. So accordingly, all these explanations are in general retrospective in nature, prospective in nature, unless otherwise specifically mentioned by the legislature. So by default, or by as a general rule, we can say that all these clarificatory or declaratory or causa omissions amendments means to place some words to clarify. So all these are generally prospective in nature, but sometimes it is also mentioned in the statute that these are retrospective also. So accordingly, we have to understand the provision of tax statute. So while interpreting the tax statute and international treaty, as we know that government of India has various treaties with different countries, and the provisions of treaty override the provision of income tax law. So if the treaty is beneficial, then the treaty provision will be applicable. If the tax statute is beneficial, then provision of tax statute will be applicable in respect of transaction or income of non-resident or foreign company, as we know that. So there is provision in section 159 subsection 7 of the new Income Tax Act 2025, where there is how to interpret the words used. So firstly, we have to refer the term assigned in the tax treaty itself. If the word is not defined in the treaty, then we must refer to the provisions of Income Tax Act 2025. Then if Income Tax Act does not has defined the particular word, then we may refer to the notifications, if any, issued explaining the particular words. If there is no notification at all, then we must refer to the central act related to tax, we may refer to. Or if there is no central tax laws, then we may refer to any central law. This is another important point. And if there is no central law on a particular point defining that term, then we may refer to General Clause Act. So all these are mentioned in section 159 subsection 7. How to interpret the taxation of non-resident or foreign company, we have just explained. Now there is law of precedent. As we know that the judgment of Apex Court and Jurisdiction High Court is binding on lower authority or subordinate courts. So Article 141 of the Constitution of India has a provision where the judgments of Apex Court or Supreme Court is binding upon all the subordinate courts. Then another important concept is ratio decidendi, we will discuss in details. Then obiter dicta, another concept we will discuss. Then estate decisis and principle of judicial discipline we will discuss. Then doctrine of per incuriam we will discuss. But before that, we must understand one of the important article, which is Article 142, where the Supreme Court can exercise its jurisdiction and pass any decree or order for complete justice. This is the important aspects of our constitution and constitutional law, because this law provide power to the Supreme Court to pass any order or any writ for complete justice, and this is beyond any statute, because this law is provided and give preference to equity over the law. Sometimes law does not provide equity, so but law must be a tool for justice and equity. So if there is loss of equity in favor of someone, then the Supreme Court, using Article 142, provide equity, and equity gets preference over the statute. So because since this is a specific circumstances, a specific judgments of Supreme Court, therefore this judgments has no relevance or no precedence value. So any judgments pronounced under Article 142 by the Supreme Court has no precedence for subordinate courts that we must taken care of. So this is outside the Article 141, and otherwise remaining judgments of Apex Courts is binding on all the subordinate courts. That is very important. But important aspect is that what is binding on all is not only the complete judgment, but the ratio decidendi of the judgment is, that is essence of the decision, is binding on all the subordinate courts. That is very important point. So how to find out ratio decidendi is very important aspect. So in the case of a state of Gujarat versus Utility Welfare Association of People 2018 judgment, where Apex Court has explained how to find ratio decidendi in any judgment. So if you remove any text of judgment from the judgment, and the effect or judgment does not change, then it is not ratio decidendi. If you remove the ratio decidendi portion of the judgment from the judgment, then you could find that the judgment will change. So that is relevant and important aspect, which is the ratio decidendi, and it is binding on all the subordinate courts and other authorities in the country. Then there is obiter dicta, which is also important to note that some pronouncement by Apex Court time to time while delivering judgment, but that is not important for or binding for anyone, because that is just expression of court but not part of judgment. So another important aspect is stare decisis and judicial discipline, because judicial discipline is the only tools for consistency of the law pronounced by various courts. So judicial discipline is important not for tax authorities but also for courts, so that the taxpayer could predict the provisions of tax laws, their valuations, the tax rate, etc. So judicial discipline is very important, and accordingly In one of the landmark judgment in Shankar Raju versus Union of India 2011 to SCC 132 para 10, it was noted that it is a settled principle of law that judgment which has held the field of for a long time should not be unsettled unless, and if there is contrary view, then the bench should refer the matter to larger bench, and by referring to the Chief Justice, larger bench will be constituted for this point. So another important point is per incuriam. Sometimes the judgment we got judgment, but judgment in judgments the details law not discussed, or important aspects of apex court not discussed, or relevant portion of judgment of apex court not deliberated upon, or a statute already got changed but not discussed by the courts. So the judgment itself is defective judgments not based on the law of land on a particular point. So such judgments are called per incuriam, which is not binding at all. Then while making all these things and implementing in the tax laws, particularly in the assessment, the important point we must keep by the taxpayer as well as by the assessing officer, particularly the rule of law as expressed by A.V. Dicey. The element of rule of law is the principle of natural justice must be complied. So AO is bound to give notices and opportunity to the taxpayer to make reply. Then the order must be reasoned order so that judicial scrutiny could be made of those orders. While providing evidence, it is the taxpayer duty to provide original direct evidence, primary evidence, documentary evidence which got priority. If there is uncertainty or unavailability of the original evidence or documentary evidence, then certainly we can provide secondary evidence, oral evidence or circumstantial evidence. Then another important point is additional evidence. By default, we cannot provide any additional evidence at the appellate stage, but in certain cases there are exceptions, we must note thereof. Then before the final assessment order, there must be draft order or so-called notice. Then time limit is another important aspect, and the jurisdiction of the AO or the person making assessments is also important. Then the prescribed procedure under the statutes must be taken care of, and more important and last important point is the mistake of facts and law. So assessment order must be without any mistake of facts or law, or if there is any mistake of law or facts in any assessment order or any order, then if the order is appealable, then certainly we should refer to for appeal. So we have just discussed important aspects of interpretation of tax statute in a summary form, and we have tried to cover up all important judgments related to the interpretations. I hope you are enjoying the videos, and I request you to share and subscribe the videos, and also press bell icon so that you will get all the important notifications of latest videos time to time. You are once again requested to subscribe the channel immediately for important videos, and you are also requested to share the videos among your friends for larger public interest. Just we are discussing all the important aspects of new income tax provisions and how to understand. Thank you for watching. Thanks again for watching the DNA of tax laws. Thanks.